Chapter 1. The Silence. The big wooden doors of the castle opened with a slow, low sound. It was not a loud creak. It was a soft, heavy sound. It was the sound of a door that had done its job well for many years. Elian stood in the doorway. He was the keeper of the hall. He wore a soft gray coat made of wool. It was thick and warm. On his feet he wore thick socks inside soft leather shoes. When he walked, he made almost no noise. Elian looked into the great hall. Yesterday the hall had been full. There had been music, there had been laughter, there had been the sound of silver forks touching china plates. There had been hundreds of people in bright clothes celebrating the winter solstice. They had danced. They had eaten sweet cakes. They had shared stories near the fire. But now it was January. The guests had gone home. The music had stopped. The musicians had packed their instruments into cases and left in their carriages. The cooks were asleep in the kitchen. The king and queen were asleep in their tower. The castle was empty. The castle was quiet. Elian took a deep breath. The air in the hall was cool. It smelled faintly of pine trees and old wax candles. It smelled like the end of a party. It was a calm smell. He stepped inside and closed the heavy doors behind him. Click. The latch fell into place. Now he was truly alone. The room was very large. The ceiling was so high up that it was lost in the shadows. The walls were made of smooth gray stone. In the center of the room there were 3 long wooden tables. They were empty now. The chairs were pushed back, sitting at odd angles, just where the guests had left them. The only light came from the fireplace at the far end of the hall. The fire was low. It was no longer a roaring blaze. It was just a bed of glowing red coals. Every now and then a small orange flame would pop up, dance for a second, and then vanish. The red glow from the coals painted the floor in soft colors. The shadows stretched out long and thin across the stone. Elian liked this time the best. He liked the party, yes? It was nice to see people happy. But he liked the cleanup more. He liked the quiet. He liked putting things back where they belonged. He liked the feeling of order returning to the world. He walked slowly across the stone floor. Tap, tap, tap. His soft shoes made a gentle rhythm. He walked to the first window. It was a tall, arched window with thick glass. He looked outside. The world was white and blue. Snow covered the ground in a thick blanket. The trees in the courtyard were bare and black against the snow. The moon was high in the sky, a perfect white circle. It was a cold night, but inside, Elian was warm. He turned back to the room. There was so much to do, but there was no rush. There was no hurry. The sun would not rise for many hours. He had all night. He could take his time. He looked at the decorations. The hall was still dressed in its winter finery. There were garlands of green pine branches wrapped around the stone pillars. There were silver stars hanging from the ceiling on thin, invisible strings. There were red velvet ribbons tied to the backs of the chairs. There were hundreds of white candles, now melted down to small stumps, sitting on the tables and shelves. They were beautiful. But the season was over. It was time for them to rest. It was time to put them away in their boxes. It was time for the hall to be just a hall again. Elian walked to the center of the room. He stood still for a moment, just listening. He heard the wind blowing softly outside the thick walls. Whoosh, whoosh. He heard the settling of the old stones. He heard the crackle of the last log in the fire. It was a heavy, comfortable silence. It felt like a warm blanket wrapped around his shoulders. "Time to begin," he whispered to himself. His voice was soft, barely a sound. He walked to the corner of the room where the storage chest sat. It was a large chest made of dark oak wood. It had iron bands around it. Elian knelt down. The stone floor was cool against his knees, but his wool pants were thick. He reached out and lifted the lid of the chest. It opened smoothly. Inside, there were stacks of cardboard boxes. There were piles of soft white paper for wrapping. There were rolls of twine. He took out the first box. It was a small box, perfect for small things. He set it on the floor. He took a piece of the soft white paper and crinkled it in his hand. It made a dry, crisp sound. He stood up and looked at the nearest pillar. Wrapped around the stone was a long green garland of pine. Tucked into the pine branches were small glass birds. They were delicate. They were painted with blue and silver wings. Elian approached the pillar. He reached out his hand. His fingers were steady. He touched the first glass bird. The glass was cool and smooth. He carefully unhooked the wire from the pine branch. He held the bird in his palm for a moment, admiring the way the firelight caught the silver paint. "Sleep well?" he thought. He carried the bird to the box. He wrapped it in the soft white paper. He folded the paper over the head, then the wings, then the tail. Now it was just a soft white ball. He placed it gently into the box. He went back to the pillar. He found the second bird. Unhook, hold, carry, wrap, place in the box. He found the third bird. Unhook, hold, carry, wrap, place in the box. He did this again, and again, and again. There was no sound in the hall except for the soft rustle of the paper and the slow steps of the keeper. Rustle, fold, place, rustle, fold, place. The box began to fill up. The pillar began to look bare. The party was fading away, one small piece at a time. The silence grew deeper. The night grew older, and Elian continued his work, slow and steady, with a heart full of peace. Chapter 2. The Silver Stars. Elian placed the lid on the first box. The glass birds were safe inside. He pushed the box gently to the side. It slid across the stone floor with a dry, whispering sound. Shh. He stood up and stretched his back. He rolled his shoulders slowly. Forward, then back. It felt good to move. He looked up toward the ceiling. Above the long tables floating in the dark air were the stars. They were not real stars, of course. They were made of thin metal, polished until it shone like a mirror. Each star had 5 points. They hung from the wooden beams on long, thin strings. In the dim light of the dying fire, they caught the red glow. They twinkled just a little bit. There were many stars. Elian counted them silently. 1, 2, 3, 10, 20. There were 20 silver stars. "You are next," Elian said softly. He could not reach the stars from the floor. They were too high. He needed the ladder. He walked to the far corner of the great hall. There, leaning against the gray wall, was the library ladder. It was made of dark, heavy oak wood. It had wide steps. It was a sturdy ladder. It had helped keepers reach high places for 100 years. Elian placed his hands on the sides of the ladder. The wood was smooth and polished from use. He lifted it. It was heavy, but Elian was strong from years of work. He carried the ladder to the center of the room. He set it down carefully. He did not want to make a loud noise. He set down the left leg. Then he set down the right leg. The ladder settled onto the stone floor. It was solid. It did not wobble. Elian looked up at the first star. It was hanging right above the main chair where the king usually sat. Elian stepped onto the first rung of the ladder. The wood creaked just a tiny bit, a friendly sound. He stepped up to the second rung. He stepped up to the third rung. Now he was high up. The air felt a little warmer here, closer to the ceiling. The floor looked far away. The room seemed even bigger from up here. He reached out his hand. The silver star was spinning slowly in the air currents. It turned left, then it stopped, and turned right. Elian waited for it to stop. He was patient. When the star was still, he caught it gently with his fingers. The metal was cool. It was thin and light. He found the hook where the string was attached to the beam. Carefully, he lifted the string. Click. The hook came free. The star was in his hand. He held it close to his chest. He looked at the silver surface. He could see his own reflection in the metal. His face looked calm. His eyes looked tired, but happy. "Come down now," he whispered. He stepped down to the second rung. He stepped down to the first rung. He stepped onto the stone floor. He carried the star to the table. He had brought a new box. This box was wider and flatter. It was lined with soft gray felt. Elian placed the star into the box. It fit perfectly. The gray felt was like a soft bed for the silver metal. He went back to the ladder. He had to move it a few feet to the left. He lifted it, he shifted it, he set it down. Left leg, right leg, solid. He climbed up again. Step 1, step 2, step 3. He reached for the second star. This one was hanging slightly lower. He unhooked it. He held it safe. He climbed down. Step 2, step 1. Floor. He walked to the table. He placed the second star next to the first one. They lay side by side, shiny and quiet. He did this again. He moved the ladder. He climbed up. He took the third star. He climbed down. He put it in the box. The rhythm took over. It became a dance. Lift, move, set, climb, reach, unhook, descend, walk, place. Elian did not think about anything else. He did not think about the snow outside. He did not think about tomorrow's breakfast. He only thought about the stars. Lift, move, set, climb, reach, unhook, descend, walk, place. 10 stars were now in the box. The first layer was full. Elian took a large sheet of the white tissue paper. He laid it over the 10 stars. He smoothed it out with his hand. The paper made a soft swish sound. Now the stars were covered. They were tucked in. He began the second layer. He went back to the ladder. The hall was getting darker near the ceiling. As he took down each star, the shadows grew a little deeper. The magic of the party was being folded away. The room was becoming simple again. He climbed up for the 11th star. He climbed up for the 12th star. His legs moved automatically. His breathing was slow and even. In, out, in, out. Finally, he reached the last star. It was the 20th star. It hung near the fireplace. Elian climbed the ladder one last time. The heat from the coals was stronger here. He could feel the warmth on his cheek. He reached out. He unhooked the final star. He held it for a moment, looking down at the empty hall. Without the stars, the ceiling looked vast and high. It looked like a night sky without a moon. It was peaceful. He climbed down. Step 2, Step 1. Floor. He walked to the table. He placed the 20th star into the box. It was the last piece of the puzzle. The box was full. He placed another sheet of white paper over the top. Then he took the cardboard lid. He lowered it onto the box. Thwump! The lid settled tight. The stars were gone. They would sleep in the dark until next winter. Elian looked at the ladder. He did not need it any more tonight. He lifted it and carried it back to the corner. He leaned it against the wall. It looked like a shadow in the dim light. He dusted off his hands. He looked at the ceiling. It was bare. It was clean. The room felt bigger now. It felt more open. The air seemed to flow more freely without the ornaments hanging in the way. Elian smiled. One job finished. Many more to go. But that was okay. The night was long, and the silence was his friend. He looked at the chairs. They were next. They had red ribbons on them. Bright, festive red ribbons. They looked too loud for this quiet room. He walked toward the first chair. Chapter 3. The Velvet Ribbons. Elian turned his attention to the floor. The tables were surrounded by chairs. There were many chairs. There were heavy chairs made of dark wood for the adults. There were smaller, lighter chairs for the children. Every single chair had a decoration. Tied to the back of every chair was a ribbon. It was a wide, red ribbon. It was made of velvet. Elian walked to the first chair. It was a tall chair with a high back. He ran his hand over the wood. It was smooth and cool. Then he touched the ribbon. The velvet was different. It was soft and fuzzy. It felt warm against his fingertips. It was a deep, rich red color, like a winter berry. The ribbon was tied in a big bow. It was a cheerful bow. The loops were large and floppy. The ends of the ribbon hung down toward the floor. "Time to untie," Elian whispered. He stood behind the chair. He looked at the knot. It was not a tight knot. It was a simple bow knot. He took hold of one of the loose ends. He pulled it gently. Slip. The loop disappeared. The knot dissolved. The ribbon fell straight. Now it was just a long strip of red fabric hanging over the wood. Elian took the ribbon off the chair. He held it in both hands. It was long. If he dropped it, it would touch the ground. He needed to roll it up. If he just threw it in a box, it would get wrinkled. Next year, it would look messy. Elian did not like messy things. He wanted the ribbon to be smooth and perfect for next year. He found the very end of the ribbon. He pinched it between his thumb and finger. He folded it over once, a tiny fold. He folded it over again. Then he started to roll. He rolled the ribbon tightly. Roll, roll, roll. His fingers moved in a small circle. The roll of red velvet grew bigger. It looked like a red snail shell. It looked like a red rosebud. He rolled until he reached the other end. Now he held a perfect tight circle of velvet in his hand. It was solid. It was neat. He walked to the table. He had brought a long, narrow wooden box. This box was divided into small square sections. It was made for ribbons. He placed the red roll into the first square section. It fit snugly. It would not unravel. Elian went back to the chairs. He moved to the second chair. He stood behind it. He saw the bow. He pulled the string. Slip. The knot came undone. He took the ribbon. He found the end. He started to roll. Round and round. Over and over. The smooth side of the ribbon touched the fuzzy side of the ribbon. The motion was very soothing. It was just his fingers moving. The rest of his body was still. He walked to the box. He placed the second roll next to the first one. 2 red circles in a row. He went to the third chair. Pull, slip, untie, roll, roll, finish, place in the box. He went to the fourth chair. Pull, slip, untie, roll, roll, finish, place in the box. The pile of ribbons in the box began to grow. It looked like a box of red candies. Elian worked his way down the long table. He moved from right to left. He did not skip any chairs. He gave each chair the same attention. He did not rush. Sometimes a knot was a little tight. Someone had leaned back and pulled it. Elian did not get frustrated. He just used his fingernails to gently loosen the fabric. He wiggled the knot, left, right, until, slip, it came free. The sound in the hall was very quiet, just the soft sound of velvet rubbing against velvet. Swish, swish, and the sound of Elian's shoes. Tap, tap. He finished the first table. He moved to the second table. His hands knew what to do. He did not even have to look closely anymore. His fingers remembered the shape of the ribbon. Pull, roll, box. Pull, roll, box. It took a long time. There were 60 chairs. But Elian enjoyed the time. With every ribbon he removed, the room became calmer. The bright splashes of red were disappearing. The natural colors of the wood and stone were coming back. The frantic energy of the party was being rolled up, inch by inch, and put away. Finally, he reached the last chair. It was a small chair at the end of the third table. The ribbon was shorter here. Elian untied it. He rolled it up. It made a small, cute roll. He walked to the box. He placed the last roll in the last empty square. The box was full. Rows and rows of red velvet circles, all safe and tidy. Elian closed the lid of the wooden box. It had a small brass latch. Click. Locked. He looked at the chairs now. They stood in straight lines. They looked bare. They looked honest. They were just wood now. Strong, simple wood. They looked ready to rest. Elian rubbed his hands together. They felt warm from handling the velvet. He looked around the room. The ceiling was clear. The chairs were clear. But the walls still had their lights. Along the stone walls there were glass lanterns. Inside them were candles. The candles were out, but the glass was smoky. Elian picked up a soft cloth from his supply pile. "Time to clean the glass," he said. He walked toward the wall. Elian walked to the stone wall on the left side of the great hall. The wall was rough and cool. Every few feet there was an iron bracket fixed to the stone. Holding onto each bracket was a lantern. These were not like the floating stars or the velvet ribbons. These were permanent. They stayed on the walls all year. But tonight they looked tired. During the party, candles had burned inside them for hours. The flames had danced and flickered. Now the glass panes were cloudy. They were covered in a thin layer of gray soot from the smoke. They looked dull. Elian stood in front of the first lantern. It was at the height of his shoulder. He did not need the ladder for this. He looked at the lantern. It was a square box made of black iron and thick glass. It had a small door on the front with a tiny latch. Elian reached out. He lifted the tiny latch with his thumb. Click! He pulled the little door open. It made a small squeak. Ee! It was a high, rusty sound. He reached his hand inside the lantern. The air inside was cold now, but it smelled strongly of burnt wick. It was a sharp, smoky smell. In the center of the lantern sat the remains of a candle. It was just a stump now, a puddle of white wax with a black wick in the middle. It had done its job. It had given light. Now it was finished. Elian used his fingernail to pry the wax loose from the metal base. Snap! The wax stump popped off. It was hard and cold. Elian placed the old piece of wax into a waste bucket he carried with him. Thud! Now the lantern was empty, but it was still dirty. Elian took the soft cloth from his pocket. It was an old rag, soft from many washings. He bunched it up in his hand. He leaned forward and breathed onto the glass pane. Ha! A circle of white fog appeared on the glass. It faded quickly. Elian rubbed the glass with the cloth. He moved his hand in small circles. Rub, rub, rub. He pressed firmly. The gray soot wiped away. The glass began to squeak. Squeak, squeak. He cleaned the front pane. He reached inside to clean the side panes. This was harder. He had to twist his wrist. He worked slowly. He did not want to miss a spot. He cleaned the left side. He cleaned the right side. He cleaned the back. When he was finished, he pulled his hand out. He closed the little iron door. Click. He stepped back to look. The lantern looked new again. The glass was clear. It reflected the glow of the fireplace across the room. It sparkled just a little bit. Elian smiled. One clean lantern. He took 2 steps to the right. He stood in front of the second lantern. Open the latch. Click. Open the door. Remove the wax. Snap. Bucket. Thud. Breathe on the glass. Ha. Rub the glass. Rub, rub, rub. Close the door. Click. It was a perfect routine. It was simple work. It was work that let his mind rest. He moved to the third lantern. 2 steps. Stop. Open. Clean. Close. He moved to the fourth lantern. 2 steps. Stop. Open. Clean. Close. He worked his way down the long left wall. There were 12 lanterns on this wall. He cleaned every single one. He did not rush. He watched the gray soot disappear and the clear glass appear. It was satisfying. It was like wiping the sleep from the castle's eyes. When he finished the left wall, he walked across the back of the room. He passed the heavy wooden doors. He checked the lanterns there, too. Open, clean, close. Then he started on the right wall. Here, the lanterns were closer to the windows. The moonlight hit them. When Elian cleaned the glass here, the moonlight shone through them clearly. He worked his way back toward the fireplace. The bucket grew heavier with old wax stumps. The cloth grew darker with soot. But the room grew brighter, not because there was more light, but because the things in the room were clean. They felt fresh. Finally, he reached the last lantern. It was right next to the fireplace. The metal was warm here. Elian opened the door. He took out the last piece of wax. He wiped the last pane of glass. He was very thorough. He wiped the corners. He wiped the edges. He closed the door. Click. He stood back and looked at the walls. 24 lanterns, all empty, all clean, all closed. They stood in a row like silent guards. They were ready for the next night or the next week. They did not need to be used right now. They could just sit there and be beautiful. Elian put the dirty cloth back in his pocket. He picked up the bucket of wax. It was heavy now. The walls were done. The ceiling was done. The furniture was done. Elian looked down at his feet. He looked at the floor. The floor was made of wide gray stones. In the light of the fire, he could see things on the floor. There were tiny brown needles. They had fallen from the pine garlands. There was a little bit of dust. There was a little bit of glitter from the guests' clothes. Elian sighed happily. He knew what to do next. It was his favorite part. It was time for the broom. Elian walked to the small utility closet near the entrance. It was a narrow door, barely visible in the shadows. He opened it. Inside, hanging on a wooden peg, was his broom. It was a good broom. It was an old broom. The handle was made of smooth, pale ash wood. It had been held by Elian's hands thousands of times. The bottom was made of stiff yellow straw. The straw was tied tightly with twine. Elian took the broom off the peg. He held it in his hands. It felt balanced. It felt like an extension of his own arm. He walked to the far end of the great hall, near the heavy double doors. He turned his back to the doors and looked out across the vast expanse of the floor. From here, the room looked like a sea of gray stone. But if you looked closely, like Elian did, you could see the mess. There were thousands of pine needles. They were tiny, thin, and brown. They had dried out in the heat of the room and fallen from the garlands. They were scattered everywhere, under the tables, near the chairs, in the open spaces. When Elian stepped on them, they made a tiny crunch sound. He placed the bristles of the broom on the floor. Scritch. The sound was dry and rough. He began to sweep. He started in the corner. He pulled the broom toward his feet in a long, steady stroke. Swish. The straw bristles dragged across the stone. They caught the pine needles. They caught the dust. They caught the little bits of glitter. He took a step to the side. He pulled the broom again. Swish. He found a rhythm. It was a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Step, sweep, step, sweep, step, sweep. The sound echoed softly in the large, empty room. It was a comforting sound. It sounded like work being done. It sounded like cleanliness. Elian did not hurry. He watched the floor intently. Before the broom, the stones were speckled with brown needles. After the broom, the stones were clean and gray. He was clearing a path. He was erasing the mess. He swept the dust into a small line. Then he pushed the line forward. The line became a small pile. He pushed the pile a few feet. Then he went back to sweep a new section. He moved around the legs of the first table. He had to be careful here. He swept around the left leg. Swish. He swept around the right leg. Swish. He reached the broom deep under the table to catch a dust bunny hiding in the dark. He brought it all out into the open. He added it to his pile. The pile of pine needles grew. It was a mixture of brown needles, gray dust, and sparkles. Elian moved the pile slowly across the room. He was herding it like a shepherd herds sheep. He was moving it toward the fireplace. He swept past the first window. The moonlight showed him where the dust was. He swept past the second window. He swept past the third window. His arms moved back and forth, back and forth. It was a gentle exercise. His muscles felt warm and loose. He reached the middle of the room. The pile was getting bigger now. It rustled when he pushed it. Rustle, rustle. He stopped for a moment to rest. He leaned on the broom handle. He took a deep breath. The air smelled less like pine now and more like stone. The smell of the forest was leaving. The smell of the castle was returning. He started again. Swish, swish, swish. He swept the area around the king's chair. He swept the area in front of the musician's platform. He swept the long stretch of floor leading to the kitchen door. Slowly, very slowly, he made his way to the fireplace. The fire was very low now, just a faint red glow. He pushed the big pile of sweepings onto the stone hearth in front of the fire. He put the broom down. He picked up a flat metal dustpan and a small hand brush. He knelt down on the hearth. The stones here were warm against his knees. He used the small brush. Whisk, whisk. He swept the pile onto the dustpan. It took 3 scoops to get it all. He stood up. He walked to the side of the fireplace where the ash bucket stood. He tipped the dustpan. Slide. The pine needles and dust slid into the bucket. They were gone. Elian picked up his broom again. He walked back to the center of the room. He looked at the floor. It was perfect. The gray stone stretched out in all directions, clean and bare. There was not a single needle left. There was not a speck of dust. The floor looked wide and open. It looked cool. It looked like a calm lake of stone. Elian walked back to the closet. He hung the broom on its peg. It dangled there, tired but ready for tomorrow. He closed the closet door. Click. He returned to the hall. The walls were clean. The floor was clean. The ceiling was clean. But the tables? The 3 long tables still had their white cloths on them. The cloths were stained with wine and sauce. They were wrinkled. Elian walked to the first table. He ran his hand over the fabric. It was rough linen. "Time to reveal the wood," he said. Elian stood at the head of the first long table. It stretched out in front of him like a white road. The table was covered in a heavy white cloth made of linen. It hung down low on the sides, almost touching the floor. The cloth had been crisp and clean yesterday. Now it was soft and used. There were small purple spots where wine had spilled. There were small yellow crumbs from the bread. Elian reached out and took hold of the hem of the cloth. The fabric was thick. It felt cool and dry in his hands. He pulled gently. The cloth slid across the wood. Swish. It was a long, satisfying sound, like a heavy sigh. He pulled it until the whole cloth was bunched up in his arms. It was a big bundle of white fabric. It was heavy. He carried it to the end of the table. He could not fold this alone. It was too big. But Elian knew how to fold it by himself. He had done it for 40 years. He laid the cloth back down on the bare wood, but this time he folded it in half lengthwise. He walked to one end. He smoothed it out with his hands. Swipe, swipe. He walked to the other end. He smoothed it out there too. He picked up the corners. He walked them down to the other end. Fold. He smoothed the fabric again. He pressed down on the fold to make it sharp. He folded it again, and again, and again. The giant white sheet became a smaller square, then a smaller square, then a neat thick rectangle. Elian patted the folded cloth. It was solid. It was done. He placed it on a bench nearby. Now he looked at the table. Without the cloth, the table was beautiful. It was made of old, dark oak. The wood was nearly black in the dim light. It was strong. It had been a tree in the forest 300 years ago. You could see the history of the castle in the wood. There were scratches from knives. There were rings from hot mugs. There were smooth spots where people had rested their elbows for generations. But the wood looked a little dry. The winter air was dry. The wood needed a drink. Elian reached into his deep pocket. He pulled out a round tin. It was a flat metal tin, dented on the sides. He twisted the lid. Creak. The lid came off. Inside was beeswax polish. It was a soft yellow paste. It smelled wonderful. It smelled like honey and sunshine and clean earth. The smell drifted up to Elian's nose. It made him feel warm. He took a clean rag from his other pocket. He dipped the rag into the yellow tin. He scooped up a little bit of the wax. He started at the top of the table. He pressed the rag onto the dark wood. He moved his hand in a circle. Rub, rub, rub. The wood drank the wax. As Elian rubbed, the dull surface began to change. It began to shine. It began to glow. The dark oak turned a rich, deep brown. Elian worked his way down the table. Circle, circle, circle. Dip the rag. Circle, circle, circle. His arm moved in a steady rhythm. It was like stirring a slow pot of soup. It was like rowing a boat on a calm lake. He polished the first plank. He polished the second plank. He polished the knot in the wood that looked like an eye. The smell of the beeswax filled the air around him. It mixed with the smell of the stone and the dying fire. It was a clean, healthy smell. He finished the first table. He stood back to look. The wood was gleaming. It reflected the faint light of the moon from the window. It looked nourished. It looked happy. Elian moved to the second table. He pulled off the cloth. Whish. He folded it, corner to corner, smoothed the wrinkles. Fold again. He put the folded cloth on the bench. He opened the tin. He dipped the rag. He started to polish. Rub, rub, rub. The friction made a soft sound. Swish, 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 swish. Elian's mind was completely empty. He was not worrying. He was not planning. He was just rubbing wood. He finished the second table. He moved to the third table. Pull the cloth. Fold the cloth. Stack the cloth. Apply the wax. Polish the wood. By the time he reached the end of the third table, his arm was tired. But it was a good tired. It was a gentle ache. He put the lid back on the tin. Snap. He put the rag back in his pocket. He looked at the 3 tables. They stood side by side in the center of the hall. They looked majestic. They were dark rivers of polished wood flowing through the room. They were ready to sleep. Elian picked up the stack of folded tablecloths from the bench. There were 3 thick white squares. He lifted them. They were heavy, but soft. "To the box room," he said. He walked toward the small door at the back of the hall. This was where things lived when they were not needed. Elian held the stack of white tablecloths against his chest. They smelled of wine and wax, but mostly they smelled of linen. He walked slowly away from the long tables. He walked past the fireplace. He walked past the clean, empty walls. He walked to a small, narrow door in the corner of the great hall. This door was made of thick planks. It had no handle, only a large iron keyhole. Elian shifted the heavy cloth stack to his left arm. It was difficult, but he was careful. With his right hand, he reached for the key ring on his belt. Jingle, jangle. The keys made a soft musical sound. There were many keys. A big brass one for the front gate, a silver one for the pantry, a small iron one for the tower. He found the key for the box room. It was black and old. The end of it was shaped like a square. He pushed the key into the hole. Grind. He turned it to the right. Clunk. The lock opened. Elian pushed the door with his shoulder. It swung open inward. The air inside the box room was different. It was very dry. It smelled of cedar wood and dried lavender. It smelled of old paper and dust. It was the smell of things that were sleeping. Elian stepped inside. It was dark, but he knew this room well. He did not need a light to find the shelf. The room was filled with shelves. They went from the floor all the way to the ceiling. On the shelves were hundreds of boxes, blue boxes, brown boxes, wooden crates, wicker baskets. Everything the castle owned was here. The flags for the summer tournament were in a long tube on the top shelf. The extra blankets for the winter were in a chest on the bottom shelf. The candles for the spring festival were wrapped in paper on the middle shelf. Elian walked to the section for linens. He placed the stack of tablecloths on an empty wooden shelf. Thump. They settled down. They looked like a block of white snow in the dark room. Beside them sat a small bag of dried lavender flowers. This would keep the moths away. It would keep the cloth smelling sweet until next year. Elian turned around. He walked back to the door. Just outside the door, he had left the other boxes. The boxes he had packed earlier. The box with the glass birds. The box with the silver stars. The box with the velvet ribbons. He picked up the box of birds first. He carried it into the room. He walked to the section marked Decorations. He slid the box onto the shelf. Slide. He went back. He picked up the box of stars. He carried it in. He placed it on top of the bird box. Clunk. He went back. He picked up the box of ribbons. He carried it in. He placed it next to the stars. Clunk. Now everything was inside. But there was one last thing to do, the most important thing. He had to label the boxes. If he did not label them, he might forget what was inside. Elian took a small piece of parchment from a shelf near the door. It was a scrap of paper, yellow and stiff. He took a small pencil that hung on a string from the wall. The pencil was short. It had been sharpened many times. He leaned against the door frame. The moonlight from the hall gave him just enough light to see. He wrote on the first piece of paper, Silverstars. He wrote slowly. He made the letters neat and blocky. He licked the back of the paper. It had a bit of gum paste on it. He stuck it to the star box. Pat. Pat. He wrote on the second piece of paper, Redribbons. He stuck it to the ribbon box. Pat. Pat. He wrote on the third piece of paper, GLASSBIRDS. He stuck it to the bird box. Pat. Pat. He put the pencil back. It swung on its string for a moment, then stopped. Elian looked at the shelves one last time. The boxes sat there in the dark. They were silent. They held the memories of the party. They held the spirit of the solstice. They would keep it safe. "Good night," Elian whispered to the boxes. He backed out of the room. He pulled the heavy door shut. Thump. He put the black key into the lock. He turned it to the left. Clunk. He pulled on the door handle just to be sure. It held fast. It was locked. Elian put the keys back on his belt. Jingle. He turned around to face the great hall. The storage room was closed. The cleaning was done. The organizing was done. The hall lay before him. It was a completely different place now. It was no longer a party hall. It was a sleeping giant. But there was still light in the room. The last light. Elian looked toward the fireplace. The fire was almost gone, but there was one candle left burning. "The final candle," he said. Elian turned away from the box room. He faced the great hall one last time. The room was vast. The room was silent. The 3 long tables were dark and shiny. They reflected the pale light from the windows. The floor was a sea of clean gray stone. The walls were empty of soot and shadows. The only movement in the room was the air. The only sound was the settling of the building. Elian walked toward the fireplace. The fire had burned down low. The red coals were turning into gray ash. The heat was fading. It was safe now to leave it. Elian picked up the fire screen. It was a heavy mesh made of black iron. He lifted it with both hands. Clank. He placed it in front of the hearth. It stood there like a shield. It would keep the sparks inside. It would let the fire sleep safely. Now there was only one task left. On a small round table near the bottom of the staircase stood a single candle holder. It was made of brass. It was heavy and golden. In the holder sat one tall white candle. This was the working candle. It was the candle Elian had lit when he first entered the hall hours ago. It had watched him work. It had seen the ribbons come down. It had seen the floor being swept. It had seen the wood being polished. Now the candle was short. The wax had dripped down the side in long, frozen tears. The flame was small. It was blue at the bottom and yellow at the top. It did not flicker. It stood perfectly still, like a tiny soldier. Elian walked to the small table. He looked at the flame. It was a friendly light. It was a warm light. But the work was done. Next to the candle lay a candle snuffer. It was a long brass rod with a small bell on the end. Elian picked up the snuffer. The brass felt cool in his fingers. He held the bell over the flame. He paused. He took a deep breath. He smelled the clean air of the room. He looked at the empty hall. It looked peaceful. It looked ready for the morning. "Thank you," he whispered to the room. "Sleep well." He lowered the brass bell. He moved it slowly down over the yellow flame. Down, down, down. The bell covered the light. For a second, the rim of the bell glowed orange. Then, nothing. Elian lifted the snuffer. A thin ribbon of gray smoke rose from the black wick. It twisted in the air. It danced for a moment. Then it vanished. The smell of extinguished wax drifted to his nose. It was the smell of the end of the day. Now there was no firelight. Now there was no candlelight. Elian blinked. His eyes adjusted to the change. Slowly, the room came back into view. But it was different now. The light did not come from inside. It came from outside. The moonlight poured through the tall arched windows. It was a cold, blue light. It fell across the floor in long, slanted rectangles. The dust motes in the air stopped dancing. The shadows became soft and gray. The darkness in the corners was deep and velvety. The castle felt asleep. The stone walls seemed to breathe slower. The air felt stiller. Elian put the snuffer back on the table. Clink. He put his hands in his pockets. He was standing in the dark, but he was not afraid. He knew every inch of this room. He knew where the table leg was. He knew where the first step of the stairs was. He turned his back on the great hall. He faced the stone archway that led to the tower stairs. His work was finished. His rest was waiting. He took the first step toward the archway. His shoe made a soft sound on the stone. Tap. He walked out of the moonlight and into the shadows of the stairwell. The stairwell was narrow. It curved upward in a tight spiral. The walls were made of the same gray stone as the hall, but here the stones were rougher. They were cool to the touch. Elian placed his hand on the central stone pillar. It was the spine of the tower. His hand knew exactly where to rest. The stone was smooth in the middle, worn down by centuries of hands guiding themselves up to bed. He took the first step. Step. He lifted his heavy wool coat slightly so he would not trip. He took the second step. Step. The staircase was dark, but not pitch black. There were small slits in the outer wall. These were narrow windows, no wider than a hand. Through these slits the moonlight filtered in. It painted thin, white stripes across the stairs every few feet. Elian moved through the stripes. Darkness, light. Darkness, light. He did not hurry. There was no reason to hurry. The work was done. The box room was locked. The fire was safe. The only thing left to do was to climb. He felt the weight of the day in his legs. It was a heavy feeling, but it was not painful. It was the feeling of gravity reminding him that he was part of the earth. It was a feeling that said, "You have done enough." He climbed, right foot, thud, left foot, thud. He began to count the steps in his head. He did this every night. It was a habit. It kept his mind quiet. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The air in the stairwell was still. It smelled of cold stone and night air. There was no wind here, just the quiet spiral leading up. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. He reached the first landing. This was a small flat area where the stairs paused. There was a wooden door here that led to the linen closet, but that door was closed. Elian did not stop. He turned the corner and continued up. 11, 12, 13. His breathing was steady. In, out, in, out. The sound of his breath was the loudest thing in the tower. It was a rhythmic, oceanic sound. He looked at his hand on the central pillar. His fingers trailed along the stone. He could feel the tiny bumps and dips in the rock. He traced the path upward. 14, 15, 16. He passed another window slit. He paused for a moment to look out. Far below, he could see the courtyard. It was covered in snow. It looked like a sheet of white paper. He could see his own footprints in the snow where he had walked earlier in the day. But now, fresh snow was falling. It was covering his tracks. By morning, the courtyard would be smooth again. Elian smiled. The world was cleaning itself, just like he had cleaned the hall. He turned back to the stairs. 17, 18, 19. The climb continued, up and around, up and around. The circle was gentle. It did not make him dizzy. It felt like being rocked. 20, 21, 22. He was getting higher now. He was near the top of the tower. The air was a little warmer here. Heat rises. The warmth from the day was gathered up here under the roof. 23, 24, 25. He saw the door. It was at the very top of the stairs. It was a simple door made of thick oak planks. It had a round iron handle. This was his door. Behind this door was his room. Behind this door was his bed. Elian took the last few steps slowly. He savored them. 26, 27, 28. He stood on the top landing. He took his hand off the stone pillar. His hand felt cool. He reached for the iron handle of the door. The metal was smooth. He turned the handle. Click. The latch lifted. He pushed the door open. Creak. Warm air rushed out to meet him. It smelled of dried herbs and wool blankets. It was the smell of safety. Elian stepped across the threshold. He stepped out of the stairwell and into his sanctuary. He closed the door behind him. Thud. He locked it. Click. The stairs were gone. The climb was over. He was home. Elian's room was small and round. It fit perfectly into the top of the tower. The walls were curved. They were covered in wooden panels that kept the heat inside. On the floor, There was a thick, woven rug. It was red and orange, like the colors of a sunset. It felt soft under his feet. There was a small fireplace in this room, too. It was much smaller than the one in the great hall. It was just a little nook in the wall. A small fire was burning there. It was calm and steady. It cast a warm orange light over the room. Elian walked to the wooden peg on the wall. He unbuttoned his heavy gray wool coat. Button 1, button 2, button 3, button 4. He shrugged the coat off his shoulders. It was heavy. It had protected him from the drafts of the hall all day. He hung it on the peg. Rustle. It settled against the wall. It looked like a sleeping bear. Elian sat down on the edge of his bed. The mattress gave a soft squeak of welcome. He bent down to untie his leather shoes. He pulled the laces. Left side, right side. He pulled his feet out. He wiggled his toes in his thick socks. They felt free. He stood up and changed into his night clothes. They were made of soft flannel. They were loose and comfortable. They felt like a second skin. He walked to the window one last time. It was a small window with diamond-shaped glass. He looked out. The snow was falling harder now. It was a white curtain. He could not see the ground. He could not see the trees. He could only see the white flakes swirling in the dark air. The world was disappearing under the snow. It was being wrapped up, just like the glass birds. It was being covered, just like the tables. "Good night, world," Elian whispered. He turned away from the window. He walked to his bed. The bed was the best place in the castle. It was high and wide. It had 4 wooden posts. It had a mountain of pillows. It had layers and layers of blankets. First, there was a white cotton sheet, cool and crisp. Then there was a wool blanket, thick and scratchy warm. On top, there was a down quilt. It was puffy and light as a cloud. Elian reached out and pulled back the covers. Swish. The bed opened up for him. He climbed in, first one leg, then the other. He slid his legs down between the cool sheets. He lay back. His head sank into the pillow. It was soft and deep. It cradled his head perfectly. He pulled the heavy blankets up. He pulled them up over his waist. He pulled them up over his chest. He pulled them up right to his chin. The weight of the blankets pressed down on him. It was a heavy, comforting weight. It made him feel safe. It made him feel held. He lay still. He listened to the room. He heard the wind outside, muffled by the thick walls. Whoo! He heard the tiny pop of the fire. Pop! He heard his own breathing. In, out. He closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw his day. He saw the silver stars, safe in their box. He saw the red velvet ribbons, rolled in tight circles. He saw the clean glass lanterns. He saw the shiny, polished wood of the tables. He saw the empty, swept floor. Everything was done. Everything was put away. There was nothing left to do, no list to check, no tasks to remember. His muscles began to let go. His feet relaxed. They felt heavy and warm. His legs relaxed. They sank deeper into the mattress. His hands curled loosely on the sheet. His shoulders dropped away from his ears. The bed seemed to float. The tower seemed to gently rock in the wind. Elian felt himself drifting. He was a boat on a calm river. He was a leaf falling slowly to the ground. He was a star sleeping in a box. The darkness was warm. The silence was complete. Elian took one long, slow breath, and then he was asleep. The castle slept, the snow fell, and the winter night held them all in its quiet hands. The end.